Welcome to the Trails Regional Library Missouri Bicentennial Virtual Speaker Series. My name is John Taylor. I'm a professor of history at the University of Central Missouri. The History and Communication programs at UCM are proud to partner with the Trails Regional Library on this virtual speaker series. Today, our guest speaker is Dr. Mary Collins Barile. Dr. Barile has served as an adjunct professor. She's also served as board member of the Missouri Center for the Book, Missouri Parks Association, and the Friends of Historic Booneville. She's the author of a number of books, including Haunted Booneville, Haunted Columbia, a book on the trails, and most noted, perhaps, for the edited version of Merit, Not Sympathy Wins, The Life and Times of Blind Boone. It's edited with Christine Montgomery, which Truman State University published in 2012. Merit, Not Sympathy Wins is an annotated version of Melissa Fuell Cuther's biography of Boone titled Blind Boone, His Early Life and His Achievements, which was originally published in two different versions in 1915 and again in 1919. Melissa Fuell Cuther was the first African American to publish a book-length biography on John William Blind Boone. Ms. Cuther was a retired school teacher. She was born in Warrensburg, lived in Warrensburg, actually sang with Blind Boone, and later moved to Joplin in 1905. Today we'll talk a little bit about Ms. Cuther's contributions and her connection with Blind Boone, both who had their kind of their origins in Warrensburg and then spread out from there. So please welcome Dr. Barile.
Well, there's a lot to cover. And Blind Boone, of course, is a shining star in Missouri history, as well as musical history. I think he's, outside of the ragtime world, I think he's finally starting to get his due. There have been a number of recordings and a number of musicians who have now started to address his music, which is quite difficult. I mean, John was a genius not only as a composer, but as a performer. We have at least one piece of his is lost. It's the Joplin, the tornado. But we do have a description of what the music sounded like. And he would do everything from church chimes to the sound of a spinning cyclone, to crashes. He was known to use, he went through several pianos, many pianos as a matter of fact, because he would pound on the keys to get special effects. So he was very much ahead of his time in the sense of what music could portray of, the Missouri life.
And so Boone was born in Warrensburg, and can you tell a little bit of story about his kind of brief experience in Warrensburg?
Well, his father was more than likely a white bugler in the Union Army. The ironic thing is we know that he was still alive when Boone eventually played in Kansas City, and his father was at the Kansas City Veterans Home. I've often wondered whether he knew this was his child, or if he heard him perform. It's kind of a poignant question that remains unknown right now. But, his mother took him back. She worked for some prominent people in Warrensburg. And John he was known for spending his time sitting outside. He lost his eyesight due to an infection. In those days, the idea of using antibiotics to prevent reinfection was actually didn't happen. And so they removed the eyes with the idea that it would stop any additional illness. So he had seen as a child, but I think he was about 3 when he lost his eyesight. So he was known for sitting outside and pounding on pans and pots and singing and making up musical. He was very popular with the local kids. He'd play a tin whistle. They actually had a little street band that they would play together in. He was the leader of a lot of kids. they could play rough with him. His mother didn't cut him any slack whatsoever. He may be blind, but he was not going to be special as far as she was concerned. And gosh, they would dunk him in the water. He almost drowned once. You know, he was just part of everybody's games. And they started to recognize he would go with his mom to the homes of some of the well-to-do people who she cleaned for and cooked for. And once or twice they let him play on their piano, an upright or, you know, whatever it was they had. And, you know, it was a small town at that point. Word started to get around that he could listen to something and play it back. Somebody could hum a tune and he could play it back. And we're looking at, you know, 4 or 5 years old. Mozart had essentially the same genius, that ability. Unfortunately, at that time, that ability was often conflated with a learning disability. Or if someone had, which we would say they might have been Asperger's, but they were a genius on the piano, it wasn't recognized as part of their personality. It was recognized as an outcome of a fractured mind, you know. And so that made Boone even more amazing, that he was bright. You know, he liked being around people. The town got together and they decided to send him to the School for the Blind in St. Louis, which was very nice of them, except they put this like young kid who's blind on the train by himself.
Yes.
And he was sent off to St. Louis. He enjoyed the school for a while. His instructor was very good to him and let him play the piano, while most children were sent off to learn useful things. And we'll get back to that. He studied the piano with this gentleman, who eventually left the school. And then the new person coming in, there was always a feeling of a political aspect, that here we had African-American children, you know, learning something like playing piano. That was not acceptable. So he was told to go learn to make brooms. So he spent his time for a little bit making brooms. He would slip away, according to the story. Again, here's a blind child in St. Louis, and he would head down to the, let's say the red light district, or, you know, some of the dives in the area, and he'd listen to music, the Rosebud Cafe. He'd listen to what was going to become ragtime. You know, it was a combination of African-American rhythms, some Irish rhythms, what we would start to see coming in from Western Texas as we would say jazz or the blues. You know, it was coming up from the South and in from the West on the railroad. So he was in the middle of this mix with this mind that just absorbed different sounds. Is there any wonder later on he put them together into something almost completely new? Oddly enough for him, after being told to make brooms, he ran away. And he had a very interesting, he ran away. He was picked up by a guy who, he got home, but then he was kidnapped by a con man who made him play music. Yeah, if you're really writing this, it's amazing. Who made him play music for him, and he wanted to trade him off and sell him to somebody else. And Boone was eventually rescued and brought home, and he promised he wouldn't run away again. He made money performing in the community, local community. And the thing that he made the biggest splash with, that really made his name, is there was a genius performer, Blind Tom. Mark Twain actually heard Blind Tom play. And it was said that, you know, he could play anything. Well, they said that Boone could too. And at that point he had met John Lang in Columbia. And John Lang supported him in playing against Blind Tom. And supposedly he sent Blind Tom running in fear because he was so great. But that started his career as a performance artist, not just as an object of interest. And eventually he and John Lang, who owned much land and came from a family in Columbia, settled in Columbia, started the Blind Boone Concert Company. It had different names, and they would travel. John would play in different, we have thespian halls now. Very few left. We have one in Booneville, but these would be all around the West. There would actually be sort of cycles that, or areas that you would travel to do your performances. So Boone came up with, and John, they hired singers, usually African-American women. At that time, you would have used the word colored. You would not have used the word black. Wonderful singers and sopranos, and they would travel with Boone, and they put on a full show. So there'd be, there'd be hymns, there'd be new music, there'd be novelty music, and Boone would play many of his compositions, as well as many classical compositions. One thing Boone wanted to be known as was, and later on he became known as almost strictly a ragtime performer, when in fact he wanted to be known as a classical composer. Those of you who are Gilbert and Sullivan fanatics will know that Arthur Seymour Sullivan felt the same way. He did not want to be known for HMS Pinafore. He wanted to be known for the Lost Chord. Let's be grateful Pinafore still exists. So Boone went on to have traveled for many years, passed away in the 1920s. When he passed away, he was quite not destitute, but close to it. He is buried in Columbia. The cemetery did not have a stone for many years. Finally, the 1960s, I believe, they got together, and his piano, which was loaned to somebody, was then sold and lost, and eventually turned up in and I'm going to forget which town it was in Missouri, purchased back, restored. Now you can see it and hear it at the Boone County Historical Society. Boone used to play at the local schools. He was famous with the school children. Every day they'd come and they'd take him around town to do his chores because he couldn't see. But the joke was he would always lead them back to the candy store at the end. Purchase them the candy, and they were characters. He and John Lang were characters. They had a parrot. They would take the parrot with them, and the parrot would fly. They would take the parrot, and the parrot would fly up and start sitting on the cross wires of the telegraph pole and yell about Blind Boone's playing tonight. So it was a show, but it was also grounded in classical music and music that Americans thought was uplifting. That's why ragtime was a little bit out this way. It was a little, was you dance too close and you dance too fast. But, if you hear a hymn or you hear a classical piece, that was acceptable. The group traveled around the circuit enough, very often played for white audiences. And of course, the sad thing was they could not stay in the towns. They had been threatened by the Klan in some places, told that they were not allowed to stay overnight unless they could find a hotel or boarding house that catered to colored performers. Pretty rare at that time, and pretty rare when you think about Missouri, Iowa, parts of Kansas. This was very, very tough. And Boone was known for his beautiful clothing and the big cars, and they actually did make it part of their image. While this was not who they were, it was that we're successful and we can stand with anybody with our talent. So he has given a lot to us out here. And I think he's, amongst the ragtime people, he's recognized, but he deserves a lot more coverage, I think, than he gets.
Can you speak to his generosity that he displayed to folks that might have been in kind of more challenging situations?
He was probably the reason he died poor. He donated, and it was not just to the Black community in Columbia at that time. It was to the white community. He helped save churches and re-roof different buildings. They built buildings that were used for schools and performances. He and John Lang both. They were, again, very well respected. Lang's parents had been, I think his father was a butcher. And I think John grew up as a butcher, as a matter of fact, too. And Boone, of course, grew up in a single family household with a mother. So where these men came from, they understood, if not poverty, they understood challenge. They understood the fact that they were part of the community and yet not part of the community. They lived in the Black Brook area of Columbia. So yes, they did fundraising, they did special events, they did concerts to raise money. If people needed help, they were there. That's pretty amazing men. And their wives, both wives were very involved. And then, as I said, John Boone, had many singers who performed with him and went on to, in some cases, professional careers as singers. Unfortunately, one or two of them, I think, died quite young from tuberculosis, which was ravaging the area at that time. So.
And then one of those singers was Melissa Fuell Cuther.
Mm-hmm.
And can you explain how they met? She was from Warrensburg as well, and what does she go on to do to kind of move Boone's legacy, at least keep, I think, his legacy alive?
Yeah, remember, there were recordings of Boone's music. I mean, there were wax cylinders, and I apologize for the dogs right now. There were wax cylinders. There were recordings. We don't have, the one or two we have, we're not certain of the speed, because after 100 and something years, we don't know what the speed was that they were played at or such. So we sort of have to imagine what Boone sounded like, what his work sounded like. So you have that part of it, but then you also have the part of the person as an individual. I mean, how many great performers have disappeared? Heck, Felix Mendelssohn was almost gone until Arthur Seymour Sullivan brought him back. Musicians were easily forgotten. In Boone's case, he was very fortunate. He and John Lang, usually what would happen is, I believe in the beginning, his wife did some of the books and helped out. As they traveled more and it became more extensive, where they worked and their performances, they'd be traveling for a good year. They would do a year's tour before they came home. So imagine that, that's 200 nights on the road at least, for your performances. And so he hired women who not only performed, it's kind of the same thing, not only performed in the group, but also would help with the correspondence and the tickets and keeping the books and such. And Melissa Fuell was one of them. She was born in 1886 in Warrensburg. Her father was quite well known. There were 10 children in the family. There's no doubt the family knew the Boones. Absolutely no doubt. Not a big, it wasn't a huge city. Her father gave money to build different buildings, again, for use by the public, donated money here and there. When he passed away, was mourned by all the communities, according to the papers. So she was relatively prominent at that time. They had a 6-room house. That was a huge house for a, quote, middle class African American at the time. She was a soprano, and she started traveling with Blind Boone's company as a young woman, very young, actually a teenager. And you'll see on some of the programs, she would do novelty songs, she would do hymns, she would do classical music and duets. There would usually about 3 or 4 other women who would travel along. And the concerts were obviously quite long. I mean, they were probably a good 2 hours. I mean, you got a lot for your 25 cents or 50 cents or $1, whatever you were doing. And when she was probably in her 20s at that point, she had decided, she was still working for Boone, and she wrote she decided to write his biography and to talk about his work, to preserve it. She felt that there was an interest in both the colored and the white community, as they put it at that time, for this kind of information. Now, people like Melissa Fuell, like women like Melissa Fuell, it speaks to also the the eye that Boone had for talent, to be honest. He understood and knew talent. Melissa went to Lincoln University and graduated from it. She scrubbed her way across the floors to earn money to go to the school there. She graduated second in her class, and she always swore that it was because it was a guy who won it. The only reason she lost was because she was up against a man. And she became a teacher. At the same time, she was performing with Blind Boone. I can't even imagine how she, did all that. She dropped out at the time she became a teacher and moved to Colorado, as a matter of fact, to try to get a teaching job. You can imagine it wasn't that easy, particularly in Missouri, for a Black teacher to get a teaching position. So she moved out west. She came back here, eventually married in Warrensburg, or Joplin, I'm sorry, in Joplin. Mr. Charles, his nickname was Sunshine Cuther or Cuther. Not sure how we pronounce it. She was in her 30s at that time, but she had written the book about Blind Boone. And that is the book that really gives us an insight into who he was, the anecdotes about his life. He wasn't, when they interviewed him, it was generally, about his car or his clothing or his music. It really wasn't about who the man was, because that wasn't interesting to anybody. So her book is very important. It actually is the first book written about an African-American performer, I believe, musician in this country. So it wasn't just in Missouri or the first book about Boone. It was the first book about, an African-American performer. She was way ahead of her time. And she continued on. Her husband and Charles and Melissa opened up boarding houses. She had spent many nights, as I had said earlier, on cold chairs and cold seats in railroad stations or driving all night, which, as you pointed out earlier, was not safe at that time. So she and Charles opened several boarding houses for Black entertainers who came through. And as John said, possibly the Negro Leagues who were traveling through. There weren't too many hotels that allowed African Americans to stay over. So they owned several. I believe there was one in Kansas City. There was some in Joplin. There was one other place, and I'm going blank on it. Charles worked at the Cana Hotel. He was the head waiter, very well respected, because in those days that was actually a career. It took skill, it took management, it took knowledge of people, it took scheduling, and it took the ability to handle all different kinds of personalities. And he was very good at it. Melissa, both of them, he was a member of the Masons. She was a member of the Order of the Eastern Star, and was very well respected. In her later years, she helped save the George Washington Carver home from destruction. She started the first African-American Girl Scout troop in Missouri. She opened up, I believe, some schools for African-American children. Even the politicians said that when they saw her coming, they knew something was in the wind and they'd better get on the ship. Oh, nobody. And evidently, she was this incredibly petite, sweet, soft-spoken woman with a backbone of steel. And look what she accomplished.
It was significant. She very active in Joplin. Do you know if she was ever active in the suffrage movement?
I never ran across any mention of that. She would have been just at that time finishing up with Blind Boone, writing her, starting to write her, or writing the book, having the book published. But I've never heard it, but it doesn't mean it didn't happen.
Right.
The unfortunate thing was both being woman and Black at the time, there were just places you didn't necessarily feel comfortable or feel secure in stating how you felt about something. Sad, but that's it. She you know, she took on education, she took on history, she took on music, she took on equality as far as rooming houses and safe, you know, a safe place went. So I would say whatever else she accomplished, boy, she did a lot. She really did. And as I said, most of the records indicate seems to have been very popular in Kansas City. When she was visiting there, there was a list. There was the Kansas City Sun, which was a Black newspaper at the time. And, you know, she'd visit there and there'd be 5, 6, 7, 10 parties given for her in her honor within 2 or 3 days. Very well respected. And unfortunately, for the most part, forgotten today, you know, except in Warrensburg, you know, and for people who understand and appreciate Boone's music. But she deserves her own biography, and I'd love it if somebody would come up to me and go, "Can I have your sources?" I would say, "Here you go, please write her biography, please do so." Just an amazing person.
Yes, I mean, they both are absolutely amazing. And one of the things that kind of the focus, a little bit of a theme of all of these presentations, and I know you have a perspective on this because you've engaged in lots of local history.
Mm-hmm.
How significant is local history to helping us understand uh, larger themes in American history?
I'm sure I'm going to make a lot of historians annoyed. I think local history is more important than the broader history. I really do, or as important. You forget your local history, you forget what your town or county or your region accomplished and your people. It's up to you to keep those people alive. You know, it's local history people who are the ones who are out there saying, "Hey, did you see this in the 1912, you know, newspaper? Melissa was doing this." I mean, that's how we get our information. Local history is so important, and it used to be that many states had county historians. I mean, I remember them, and today it's like a joke. You know, we don't have that kind of money. But the point is that you're going to forget your history. Local history is, and also local history can be the city of Joplin, but it can also be 6 blocks in Joplin, or a region in New York City or something, or just Brooklyn, you know, or Booneville. I mean, it doesn't matter. It's about everybody within that community, not just one group. And I think local historians get that. The grand sweep of history is wonderful, but it's the local history that gives it the color and the spirit and what was going on around here. You know, most backwaters or small towns are completely forgotten by national history. Not even, you know, we have to do the whole thing. I myself like to know what went on my block 150 years ago. So
Yes.
Yes.
And that's one of the purposes of this series, is to talk about kind of the history that's right outside your door that you may not quite realize is right outside your door and was actually significant.
Very much so. I mean, you know, we look at Boone, and as I said, just look at his music. I mean, I was a musician. I take one look at his, you know, piano music, and I'm like, sorry, folks. You know, there's a middle C. I can find that. It was very difficult. And in the history of music, he's gotten a lot more attention in the last generation. Not so much because of the ragtime, but because of his place. You know, who did he influence? He was a rock star for his time. I mean, this was the first time some of this music was being played, you know, themes from the Flat Branch and such in different parts of the country. So he really was a groundbreaker. And, you know, we have what, two biographies of him? Maybe 3? I think 2. That's it. I mean, we're looking at, you know, Louis Moreau Gottschalk, I mean, we know a lot about, and Boone is sort of left out there. Joplin, you know, was the one who everybody looked at as far as a ragtime musician went. And Boone was left out when, in fact, Boone influenced many of the ragtime musicians coming up later. He deserves another biography, a really one that looks and places him within the community he worked in, you know. Melissa Fuell, by all means. I mean, both of them changed how we see Missouri today. One, how we hear it, and one, how, you know, children can attend this school or a Girl Scout thing, or we can go see where George Washington Carver worked. You know, it's not lost to us. And these are people who, interestingly enough, deserve their own history, but in truth were the historians of their time. You know, and I wish we had more recordings of them. I wish I could hear their voices. That's a little hard, you know, when you've got musicians and you cannot hear anything that they did. That's difficult. But I'd like to imagine that there was a great deal of joy and pride in what they did.
Is there anything else that you would like to add to your presentation?
Oh, wow. I would say that if you can, if this inspires anybody, is to listen to Blind Boone's music. There are a number of recordings of them out there, of his pieces out there, and listen to it and become aware of, you learn a lot from listening to somebody's composition, very much so. I mean, he must have, I can't imagine being in his head when he was creating these things. I mean, the sounds and the imagery, and it's just incredible. It's incredible is that how he even had to annotate it. One of the problems was, I believe, when he was recording, he would be so fast in playing that it couldn't keep up, that some of the wax cylinders would burn out. That's another issue we had with that. You know, they could only do so much. He was so far ahead of the technology to record himself that we've kind of lost him. And to look at people who were not the famous ones. I mean, Melissa Fuell was not famous. Blind Boone was. I mean, even though she performed with him, it was John Blind Boone and his company. You know, they were always recognized for their contributions. But here's a woman who comes along and manages to build on something not long after the Civil War and make it important. I mean, again, how do you write the first biography of a Black musician? That's incredible in this country. A young woman who, as far as we know, didn't do a whole lot of writing before it. It's relatively simple. It's relatively direct. It's it's in honor of him. Very little criticism, but still, it gives you a sense of who this person was, who she saw every day. She called him Brother Boone. So there was a real connection there among people who work together. And my suggestion is to look deeper into your local history and see the people who you are missing. Because, wow, if we had lost these two, we had lost a chunk of our musical history and our culture. So,
thank you very much.